SANDHAN, All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.
Welcome students to another lecture on literature. Students of STEM 4, how does it feel to go along with all that's happening in English literature 450 years ago? Well, today we're going to talk about Elizabethan Tragedy. In order to understand Elizabethan Tragedy, I think it's important that we look at the age, because no literature survives in a vacuum. In order to understand the literature of any age, we must look at what's happening on the socio-political, economic fronts before we can really understand what kind of literature was written, before we can learn to appreciate that literature. Well, today we're going to talk about Elizabethan Tragedy. That means we have to go to the age of Elizabeth. Who was Elizabeth? Well, we are talking of Queen Elizabeth I. She ruled for a long time, and when we think of literature, we think of the period 1510 to 1602 as the Elizabethan age. It's not as if she ruled for 100 years, but she did have a long, eventful, successful rule. The Elizabethan age is also called the Age of Shakespeare, right? Why do we call it the Age of Shakespeare? Of course you know the answer, because William Shakespeare, the Bard of Avon, was the most important writer of this age. Well, I told you that in order to understand the literature of this age, we must look at the socio-political scenario first. So let's look at the first slide, my dear students. Let's see what we are doing here. Well, what are the important events that took place in this period or just before this period? Let me talk to you first about the Renaissance. Of course, you've heard the Renaissance and Reformation, even in school probably in your social studies class. But here, remember, the Renaissance was very important because in Europe, it brought to a close what was being called the Dark Ages, which lasted almost for 1,000 years, from the 4th century to the 14th century. When we talk of English literature, especially of this period, we are talking of the writings of England. But I must tell you, my dear students, and some of you probably do know, that many of these movements did not begin in England. They began, as we say, on the continent of Europe. Of course, you do know that England is a part of the continent of Europe. But when you think of the map, I'm sure you realize that the United Kingdom, Great Britain, is actually a group of islands to the left of the big continent of Europe. So most of these movements, my dear students, began on the continent. The Renaissance, Italy, Germany, France, and finally England. And what was it? It was the revival of learning. Very, very important, because this contributed and helped a great deal in the great literature that was written in this period. Let's look at the second point, and that is humanism. Human beings, mankind, the human race became important as a concept. It was not only